The HBO studio audience fell into stunned silence as Bill Maher casually opened a black leather portfolio and extracted several typed pages. For the first 15 minutes of the interview, former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi had confidently discussed her new book on government accountability, her trademark blonde hair perfectly styled and her burgundy dress commanding attention in the guest chair. But when Maher smiled thinly and said, "I've been doing some research on your career, Pam, and I found some interesting quotes from you that don't quite align with what you're saying now," the color visibly drained from her face. No one expected what happened next. Within seconds of hearing Maher begin reading her own past statements contradicting everything she had just claimed, Bondi's practiced poise completely evaporated. She frantically attempted to interrupt, her voice rising in pitch as she fumbled for explanations, even trying to physically reach for the papers in Maher's hand. By the time he finished reading her third contradictory quote, this one particularly damaging as it revealed a complete reversal on law enforcement oversight that she couldn't possibly explain away, beads of sweat had formed on her forehead despite the cool studio temperature. The panic that overtook her as her carefully crafted public image imploded in real time before millions of viewers created one of the most uncomfortably raw moments in recent television history, leaving even the normally unflappable Maher momentarily speechless at the scale of her meltdown. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation that has everyone talking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of the most revealing political showdowns that mainstream media often glosses over. Now, let's get back to the moment when Bill Maher systematically dismantled Pam Bondi's carefully crafted narrative using nothing more than her own forgotten words, leaving her in a state of complete panic before a live studio audience and millions of viewers at home. Bill Maher had cultivated his reputation over decades as television's most equal opportunity provocateur. Despite his left-leaning views on many social issues, he had built a brand around challenging orthodoxy wherever he found it, just as likely to skewer progressive excesses as conservative hypocrisy. His HBO show, Real Time with Bill Maher, operated with a freedom that network television hosts could only dream of, unburdened by advertiser concerns that might temper his approach. While he maintained a loyal viewership among political independents and free speech advocates, he remained unpredictable and occasionally controversial, the rare television host who seemed genuinely uninterested in being liked by any particular political tribe. This ideological independence made him something of a wild card for guests accustomed to more predictable partisan interviews, and his reputation for thorough research meant that unprepared guests often found themselves caught off guard. Pam Bondi, by contrast, had built her public image around consistent messaging and careful preparation. Florida's first female attorney general had leveraged her legal background and telegenic presence into a successful career as a political commentator and occasional advisor to Republican administrations. Her newest project, a book titled Accountable America: Restoring Trust in Government, positioned her as an advocate for transparency and consistent standards in public institutions. The book tour had proceeded smoothly through a circuit of friendly media outlets, where interviewers had largely stuck to her preferred talking points about the importance of holding government officials to consistent standards, regardless of political affiliation. The booking on Maher's show had raised eyebrows among her team, given his unpredictability, but the potential audience reach had ultimately proven too tempting to decline. What Bondi and her team apparently failed to appreciate was Maher's near-legendary commitment to pre-interview research, particularly when guests presented themselves as advocates for principles they might not have consistently applied throughout their careers. While other hosts might rely on staff for basic background information, Maher was known to spend hours personally reviewing a guest's public statements, looking for contradictions or hypocrisies that might prove revealing when highlighted. For a guest promoting a book about government accountability and consistent standards, this approach would prove particularly devastating. The fateful interview began innocuously enough. After concluding his regular panel discussion, Maher introduced Bondi to polite applause. "My next guest is the former Attorney General of Florida and the author of the new book, Accountable America: Restoring Trust in Government. Please welcome Pam Bondi." Bondi walked onto the set with her signature confident smile, shaking Maher's hand before settling into the guest chair. For the first several minutes, the interview followed a relatively standard pattern, with Maher asking general questions about the book's central themes of government accountability and institutional trust. "So, the main argument in your book," Maher began, "is that we've seen a dangerous erosion of trust in government institutions, and that the only way to rebuild that trust is through consistent accountability regardless of party or political considerations. Is that a fair summary?" "Absolutely, Bill," Bondi replied with practiced eloquence. "The fundamental problem we face is that too many Americans now believe there are different rules for different people depending on their political connections. When standards change based on who's being held accountable, public trust inevitably collapses. In the book, I argue that we need to return to consistent principles of accountability that apply equally to everyone in government, regardless of party affiliation." Maher nodded. "That's certainly a principle that most people would support in theory. Who could be against consistency and equal application of rules? But I'm curious how consistently you've applied that principle throughout your own career." Something in his tone caused a barely perceptible shift in Bondi's expression, a slight narrowing of the eyes that suggested a sudden wariness, but she maintained her composure. "As Florida's Attorney General, I always tried to follow the evidence and apply the law fairly, regardless of politics. That's the approach I've advocated throughout my career." "That's what I'd like to explore," Maher said, his expression changing subtly as he reached down beside his chair and produced a black leather portfolio. "I've been doing some research on your career, Pam, and I found some interesting quotes from you that don't quite align with what you're saying now." It was at this moment that the atmosphere in the studio noticeably changed. Bondi's practiced smile faltered slightly as Maher opened the portfolio and extracted several typed pages. The audience, sensing the shift, fell into an anticipatory silence. "Let's start with government oversight," Maher continued. "In your book, you write, and I'm quoting directly, 'Robust oversight of government agencies is essential to maintaining public trust, regardless of which party controls the White House.' You emphasize that congressional investigations play a vital constitutional role in this oversight." He looked up at Bondi, who nodded cautiously. "That's correct. Oversight is a crucial check on executive power." "Here's where it gets interesting," Maher continued, turning to his first page of notes. "In 2019, when discussing congressional investigations of the Trump administration, you said on Fox News, and again I'm quoting directly, 'These partisan witch hunts are an abuse of congressional power and a waste of taxpayer money. Congress should focus on legislation, not endless investigations designed to harass the president.' You called congressional oversight dangerous political theater and suggested that constant investigations undermine the ability of government to function." He looked up at Bondi. "That position seems directly contradictory to what you're advocating in your book. How do you reconcile these statements?" The directness of the question, specifically juxtaposing her book's principles against her own public statements, created an immediate tension. The studio audience stirred as they recognized the contradiction Maher had highlighted. "Well, Bill," Bondi began, her voice taking on a slightly defensive edge, "you have to understand the context of those comments. I was specifically addressing investigations that seemed politically motivated, rather than genuinely focused on oversight." "That's interesting," Maher interrupted, "because I have another quote from you from 2022, when discussing congressional investigations of the Biden administration. Here you said, 'Congressional oversight is a constitutional responsibility that must be vigorously exercised regardless of partisan objections. Claims of political motivation are simply attempts to evade legitimate scrutiny.'" He looked up again. "So congressional investigations were partisan witch hunts and dangerous political theater when directed at one administration, but a constitutional responsibility that must be vigorously exercised when directed at another. That seems like exactly the kind of inconsistent standard that your book argues undermines public trust." The systematic way Maher was building his case, using Bondi's own words against her and tying them directly to the principles she advocated in her book, created a comprehensive picture that was increasingly difficult for her to explain away. A visible uneasiness was now apparent in her posture and expression, Those statements need to be understood in their full context, Bondi insisted, her voice now carrying a distinct note of anxiety. The nature of the investigations was fundamentally different. Let's move to another topic, Maher interrupted, turning to a different page in his notes. In your book, you write extensively about the importance of transparency in government. You state, and I'm quoting again, public officials must be transparent about their actions and decisions. When government operates in secrecy, corruption inevitably follows. Bondi nodded, visibly relieved at the change of topic. Yes, transparency is essential to public trust. Yet in 2018, Maher continued, when discussing document requests related to the Trump administration, you said, "Not every document demand deserves compliance. Executive confidentiality is essential to the functioning of government, and fishing expeditions for documents undermine the presidency." You specifically defended the withholding of documents from congressional oversight, calling it a necessary protection of executive function. He turned another page. But in 2021, when discussing document requests related to the Biden administration, you said, "The American people deserve complete transparency. Claims of executive confidentiality should be viewed with extreme skepticism, as they are often used to hide information that would embarrass those in power." He looked up at Bondi, whose composure was visibly crumbling. Again, these positions are directly contradictory. The only consistent factor seems to be which administration benefited from your position at that moment. How does this reflect the principles of consistent accountability that your book advocates? By now, Bondi's professional demeanor had significantly deteriorated. Beads of perspiration were visible on her forehead despite the studio's climate control, and her hands made small, agitated movements as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't further entangle her. "Bill, you're clearly cherry-picking statements without the proper context," she said, her voice rising slightly in pitch. Each of these situations had unique circumstances that justified different approaches. What unique circumstances would justify completely opposite positions on the same principle? Maher pressed. Your book explicitly argues against situational ethics and government accountability, stating that principles must be applied consistently regardless of partisan considerations. Yet your own statements show precisely the situational approach you condemn. The audience responded with a murmur that suggested Maher's point had registered. Bondi's discomfort was now painfully apparent, her carefully maintained image of unflappable poise disintegrating under the weight of her own contradictory statements. "Let's try one more example," Maher continued, turning to a final page in his notes. "This one I found particularly striking, given your background as a prosecutor. In your book, you write about the importance of consistent legal standards, stating that the same action must face the same legal consequences, regardless of who committed it. When we apply different standards based on political affiliation, we undermine the very foundation of the rule of law." Bondi nodded stiffly, visibly bracing herself for what was coming next. In 2019, when discussing investigations into the Trump administration, you said, "The mere fact that someone hasn't been charged with a crime doesn't mean there wasn't misconduct. Prosecutors often decline to charge despite evidence of wrongdoing, and absence of charges doesn't equal exoneration." Maher looked up briefly before continuing. But in 2022, when discussing investigations into the Biden administration, you said, "In America, we have a foundational principle: innocent until proven guilty. If no charges have been filed, that means there wasn't sufficient evidence of wrongdoing. The continued treatment of uncharged individuals as if they were guilty represents a dangerous erosion of due process." He set down his notes and looked directly at Bondi. These statements directly contradict each other on a fundamental legal principle. In one case, you argue that lack of charges doesn't imply innocence. In the other, you argue that it does, with the only difference being which political side benefited from each interpretation. As a former prosecutor, advocating for consistent legal standards, how do you explain these contradictory positions? It was at this point that Bondi's panic became unmistakable. Her breathing visibly quickened, and she made a startling, impulsive movement toward the papers in Maher's hand, as if she might physically take them from him. Catching herself, she instead reached for her water glass, but her hand was shaking so noticeably that water splashed onto her. Notes. You're taking all of this completely out of context, she exclaimed, her voice now uncharacteristically high-pitched. This is an ambush. You invited me here to talk about my book, not to go through some kind of political inquisition. I am talking about your book, Maher replied calmly. Your book argues for consistent application of principles regardless of partisan considerations. I'm simply asking how you reconcile that position with your own public statements that show precisely the opposite approach, applying completely different standards to identical situations based solely on partisan considerations. These were complex situations that required nuanced approaches, Bondi stammered, visibly struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. You're oversimplifying complicated legal and political contexts to create a misleading impression. What's the complex context that would make congressional oversight a constitutional responsibility in one administration but dangerous political theater in another? Maher pressed. Or that would make lack of criminal charges evidence of innocence in one case but not in another? These aren't subtle distinctions. They're complete reversals on fundamental principles. When Bondi began another deflection about context, Maher interrupted with his most devastating question yet. Let me ask you directly. Do you believe that principles of government accountability, like congressional oversight, transparency, and legal standards, should be applied consistently regardless of which political party is in power? Or do you believe it's appropriate to apply completely different standards, depending on which side benefits politically? The directness of the question created a no-win situation. Bondi could either affirm a principle that her own statements had clearly violated, or openly embrace the situational ethics she condemned in her book. The studio fell completely silent as everyone awaited her response. Of course, I believe in consistent principles, she finally managed, though her flustered demeanor undermined any credibility in the statement. But real-world application requires consideration of specific circumstances. What specific circumstances justify complete reversal of positions depending on which party controls the White House? Maher asked. Because that's exactly what your statements show. Not nuanced application of principles, but wholesale abandonment of them when politically convenient. By this point, Bondi's panic had transformed into visible anger. You know what? This isn't a good faith discussion of my book. You clearly invited me here just to play gotcha with selectively chosen quotes. These aren't selective quotes, Maher responded calmly. They're your own words on the exact topics you discuss in your book: congressional oversight, government transparency, and legal standards. And they show that you've applied completely different standards to each depending on partisan considerations. Precisely what your book argues undermines public trust. Recognizing the no-win situation, Bondi attempted a final deflection. What about your own inconsistencies, Bill? I'm sure someone could find plenty of contradictory statements in your long career. Probably, Maher acknowledged with a slight shrug. But I'm not the one who wrote a book advocating for consistent principles regardless of partisan considerations. You did, and these statements suggest you don't practice what you preach. As Bondi struggled to formulate any effective response, Maher concluded the segment with a devastating observation. Look, the principles in your book are sound. Consistent accountability regardless of political affiliation would indeed help restore trust in government. But those principles aren't credible, coming from someone who has repeatedly applied completely different standards depending on which side benefits politically. That kind of situational ethics is exactly what has eroded public trust in the first place. With that, he turned to the camera. We'll be right back. As the show cut to commercial, the damage had been done. In just 8 minutes of precise, evidence-based questioning, Bill Maher had systematically exposed a pattern of glaring hypocrisy that directly contradicted the core premise of Bondi's book. Most devastatingly, he had done so not with partisan attacks, but by simply presenting her own words in cases where she had taken diametrically opposed positions on identical principles, with the only variable being which political party benefited. Her complete panic when confronted with these contradictions, the visible sweating, the reaching for his notes, the high-pitched defensive responses, had only amplified the impact, creating a viral moment that would define public perception of both her and her book. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours of the show's airing, clips of the exchange were being shared across social media platforms. Maher exposes Bondi's hypocrisy on her own book tour, began trending on Twitter. News sites scrambled to verify the quotes Maher had read, quickly confirming their authenticity, and in some cases finding additional examples of similar contradictions. What we witnessed wasn't typical television sparring, noted one media critic the next day. It was the methodical exposure of a fundamental credibility gap. Maher didn't need to editorialize or attack. He simply presented the guests' own contradictory statements and allowed viewers to draw their own conclusions about whether they reflected the consistent principles her book advocates. By the following morning, the exchange had become a major topic across multiple news outlets. Book tour backfires. As authors' contradictory statements exposed, read the Washington Post headline, "Principles versus Practice, Bondi's Consistency Problem." Highlighted by Maher, said the New York Times. Media analysts from across the political spectrum acknowledged that something unusually substantive had happened in what could have been just another promotional interview. For Pam Bondi, the interview marked a significant setback to her book tour and broader public image. She had entered that studio as a respected commentator promoting a book about consistent government accountability. She left with her credibility seriously damaged, having been unable to reconcile her book's principles with her own documented history of applying completely different standards depending on political affiliation. Her scheduled appearances on other programs to promote the book were abruptly canceled as publicists scrambled to regroup. In a written statement released the following day, Bondi attempted damage control. Last night's interview deliberately misrepresented my positions by isolating statements from their broader context and ignoring the specific circumstances that informed each comment. I stand by the principles in my book and my consistent advocacy for government accountability. But the carefully worded statement failed to address any of the specific contradictions Maher had highlighted or explain what context would make these opposite positions consistent. For Bill Maher, the exchange reinforced his reputation as one of television's most substantive interviewers, willing to challenge guests regardless of political affiliation. What made his approach particularly effective wasn't partisan attack, but methodical research and direct comparison of contradictory statements, allowing viewers to judge for themselves whether they reflected the principles a guest claimed to uphold. "I actually agree with the principles in Bondi's book," Maher said on his next show. "Government accountability should be consistent regardless of which party is in power. The problem is when people advocate consistency while practicing situational ethics themselves. That kind of hypocrisy undermines the very principles they claim to uphold." Media critics highlighted the interview as an example of how substantive political discourse could cut through partisan talking points. What made Maher's questioning so effective wasn't just that he challenged Bondi's positions, noted one journalism professor. It's that he did so by directly comparing her own statements on identical issues, making it impossible to dismiss as partisan attack. He showed that substantive, evidence-based questioning can expose inconsistency in a way that ideological arguments never will. Book critics who reviewed Bondi's work in the aftermath of the viral interview noted that the central weakness Maher had exposed, the contradiction between her advocated principles and her own partisan application of them, permeated the entire book. Bondi writes passionately about consistent application of standards regardless of politics, wrote one reviewer, but never addresses the apparent contradictions between these principles and her own public record of applying dramatically different standards depending on partisan considerations. Maher's interview exposed a fundamental credibility gap that undermines the book's central argument. For everyday Americans watching, the exchange offered something increasingly rare in political discourse, a moment where carefully crafted messaging collapsed under the weight of documented contradictions. It demonstrated that in an era often dominated by partisan talking points, substantive questioning that holds public figures accountable to their own stated principles could still break through. As one political analyst observed, what made this interview so compelling wasn't that it was a gotcha moment. It was that Maher took Bondi's arguments seriously enough to test their consistency against her own record. That kind of substantive engagement is what political discourse should be, rather than the partisan performance art that dominates so much of cable news. 6 months later, the impact of that explosive television confrontation continued to reverberate. The Maher treatment had entered the political lexicon as shorthand for being exposed advocating principles that one's own record contradicted. More substantively, media training for public officials and commentators now routinely included warnings about consistency in public positions, with Bondi's interview used as a cautionary example of how easily contradictory statements could be juxtaposed in the digital age. As for Pam Bondi, she had largely retreated from mainstream media appearances, her carefully cultivated image as a principled voice significantly diminished by those 8 devastating minutes on live television. Her book, which had initially been positioned for bestseller status, underperformed expectations as reviews consistently highlighted the credibility gap Maher had exposed. Bill Maher, meanwhile, had seen his ratings surge as viewers from across the political spectrum tuned in to see whether other guests would face similar substantive challenges to the consistency of their positions. The story of how Bill Maher's reading of Pam Bondi's own words left her in a state of panic serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of intellectual consistency in public discourse. It showed that sometimes the most effective political confrontations don't involve shouting or personal attacks. They simply require presenting a public figure with their own contradictory statements and allowing their inability to reconcile those contradictions to speak for itself. If you found this breakdown of one of the most effective examples of accountability interviewing in recent memory informative, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of the pivotal moments that expose hypocrisy and inconsistency in our public discourse. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Maher's interviewing technique and what other public figures should be subjected to this kind of substantive questioning.